Thanks very much. Welcome to being here today. Well, if we think back to 2012 to now, a lot has happened in this space in terms of the Royal Commission. And this has often been described as a watershed moment for survivors of child sexual abuse. And not only institutional survivors of child sexual abuse, but survivors in general. Certainly when I did my introduction to sociology, the institution of family was defined as an institution. And I'm sure if we included the institution of family in this Royal Commission, we would also be able to inquire very deeply into this issue. But Julia Gillard put a challenge out there for us back in 2013 to prevent this from happening again. And most recently, the chair of the Royal Commission, Justice Peter McLennan, reached out to survivors saying that they've waited too long for an effective response and that the future of Australian children must be given the highest priority. We've learnt a lot in that time, and there's been a lot of awareness raising, a lot of knowledge. But today we want to move to challenge and to put information out there so that knowledge becomes action. To create that legacy that means something for survivors and means something for the Australian community, and in particular men. And it's really important to think about not to separate services for survivors and keeping children safe, the next generation. Those two things go hand in hand in terms of how we create community awareness, well-being. And often those two things can be seen as separate issues. So in moving towards from a knowledge position into an action position, we need to ask ourselves, do we know enough to respond to male survivors? I think the answer now is very clearly yes. That's not to say, as a researcher, that we don't know enough. We certainly need to keep inquiring and keep moving. But we can use the knowledge we have. And knowing and awareness is not enough. We need to be thinking about how this knowledge into action also is a way of moving towards in partnership with survivors and their families and communities in how we move forward. The question here in moving towards this action problem, responding to this action problem, is do practitioners and community members know enough to respond to men who have been subjected to sexual violence? And I think what we've seen in our response over the last few years in terms of hearing survivors' stories from the Royal Commission, that in mainstream services there's still, and even in some specialist services, there's some significant gaps in knowledge for how to respond to men. What are men's needs? And still there's some myths about how male survivors respond. But most of all, the safety for men in coming forward is about the safety they experience as survivors with those who are important to them, their community, their family, their friends. That sense needs to be always the front and centre of a community response, and also within intervention services. There's been some recent examples, even in the public debate and looking at a redress scheme about male survivors that, based on old myths, I thought were largely seen off, about sexuality, about victim to offender. These things still are things we know that we can challenge, but they're still out there. So with this knowledge, we can see that male survivors, it's not an exceptional problem. The stats tell us very high percentages of men have experienced sexual violence. Back in 1975, there was estimated to be 1 case per million. Well, we know that is very wrong. We cannot say that it's an anomaly or a rarity. What we can say is the experiences of men are diverse and their needs can be diverse. So I'm not going to read these stats out, but we know that stats are significant for men. 1 in 6, 1 in 3 for women. And we also know that it's a gendered issue. That's not to say that all perpetrators are male, but the majority are. And consistently, if we look at today's sort of confirmed cases of child sexual abuse, around 1/3 of all substantiated cases involve a male child. We know that there's certain vulnerabilities. And even today, sometimes in different social spheres, people say, what do you do? What do you research? And I say, I'm very interested in this issue. And people say, is that common? And I think it's up to us all today to challenge that idea that it's out there. We've seen in the Royal Commission that in fact it's been very challenging in some of those myths around males. That the majority of people responding to private sessions have been male. The majority of survivors in religious and faith-based organisations have often been males. And we know that this experience has affected men in very different ways. For some men, it's affected them much later on in life, when the memories have come back or there's been certain triggers. I want to cover very briefly some things that we know here that we can follow up with. We know that the effects of abuse can be influenced by some factors. Now, I want to say that there can be other factors here, but the age can influence how someone experiences the impact, how often it happens, the frequency. That's not to say that a one incident experience of sexual assault can be different in terms of its impact for someone who experienced abuse over a sustained period of time. But these things can influence the outcome in some severity. The types of acts, the relationship between the offender, the situation of trust. And one issue that we'll come back to, and that's a very important issue in terms of how we respond to men, is disclosure. How do we respond when we hear a man disclose that he was sexually abused? Now, there's a range of effects, and some of these, for many of you, probably aren't surprising. It affects men across the life's course. Some of these effects may not be present at various times in their life, but may come up at different times. Depression, anxiety, hypervigilance. We know that, for example, in the general population for men, they often don't disclose issues of anxiety and depression and suicidal thoughts. We know that this is a significant male health problem. And this issue of sexual violence for male survivors is significant in this. And that's why I think we also need to situate this issue as a public health issue in many ways and challenge at that level, moving to action. Gary's going to come back to complex trauma in a short moment, but complex trauma perspective and framework gives an applied way of understanding the effects on men's lives, the context in which those effects can occur, the sorts of ways it can impact on men's relationships to their loved ones, to their friends, the way they find ways to cope in my experience of working with men, often men have sought lots of different avenues to cope. Some of them have been not sustainable, such as extensive drug and alcohol use that we very much have framed around self-medication. So it's moving complex trauma to ways that are sustainable to cope across the life course, that build a sense of self-integrity. Now, I've already mentioned suicidality, but some of the research I've been involved in has shown that men who have experienced child sexual abuse can be 10 times more likely to report suicidal ideation when compared to the general population of men. Now, even if we account for some statistical errors here, this is pretty significant statistic. And when we look at depression, it can be up to 5 and 6 times the rate in the general population. There's a slide just to the left or right of that, depending where you're sitting, that Gary just wants to comment on.
This was actually 2011. This was part of one of the pieces of research that came out of Ballarat. What's interesting about this was that this is one of the things that started the Victorian inquiry, which led to the Royal Commission. And what's depressing about this is that that figure is actually now incorrect. We know that 40 men we know have committed suicide from the Ballarat region who were sexually abused by these two perpetrators in that time. At the Royal Commission, one of the men from one of those schools held up a picture of his Year 1 class, and he said 6 of these boys are no longer with us. 6 of these boys are now dead. So to have it really kind of drills home, or to appreciate in the sense of the level of impact at a kind of those people who've experienced abuse, but the whole community, about the lives and the family members of those men. And this is one of those kind of challenge areas, and I might come back to that. But I mean, it's one of those things that we haven't spoken about and yet haven't been aware of. And many of those men in harming or committed suicide, people weren't aware at the time that they had been sexually abused or that they were at that time. So we're only now beginning to understand the depth of the problem for men around this.
And when we think about what factors, when we do some knowledge on influence more suicidal thoughts and actions, they're the things about silence, feeling isolated and alone. They're the things about masculine norms, how to be a real man. That often we promote these ideas about masculine identity that doesn't associate with men feeling vulnerable, asking for help, that aren't associated with being a victim. And these things can eat away at men's hopes. One of the really critical things here that in moving to action is to provide hope. There are many hopeful stories amongst survivors that give other men strength to speak out about this issue. And that is so important. And when we think about hope, men often have a hope when they tell or disclose that things might change. Well, intuitively it should be that way. But what we know and ongoing research shows that when men disclose, they often don't get an appropriate response or an adequate response. And if you think about it, if you wanted to tell someone, if you think about your own life, not about sexual abuse, but something private or something that's really been troubling, you don't want to go and tell your social worker or your psychologist or your doctor. You want to tell someone who's important to you, that understands you. Might be your mum, might be your dad, might be a really close friend, might be a brother, a partner. But often those people don't always have the knowledge they need to be able to respond in a way that's helpful. And that's so important in the response. And for children today, they still want to tell those people if something's going wrong in their life. So it's very critical that we think about disclosure, and particularly for boys. The research shows that overwhelmingly males delay disclosure, are significantly less likely to tell anyone when abuse is occurring to them.
Yeah, that's right.
And some of the research shows it can be somewhere around onwards of 10 years, 22 years, 30 years before men maybe make a disclosure and then think about having a discussion with someone about that experience, putting their hand up for help. These are really challenging moments for men. And whilst it has been a moment in Australia's history, in Queensland's history, for more survivors to speak out, men and women in solidarity as survivors, many survivors that were abused decades ago still haven't had that moment for whatever reason. And the closure of the Royal Commission at the end of this year shouldn't be the end of that. There needs to be forums and processes for survivors to continue to have the opportunity to speak out and share their experience and have their experience acknowledged. Not just acknowledged by friends and family, but acknowledged that the state, that the organisation, that the family has some responsibility. So there's some barriers that I've covered here, but some of the things are about ideas that are limited to about manhood. Is it okay to tell? What will people think of me? Shame, doubt, blame of others. These can be barriers for men. There can also be barriers that particularly are improving now. If you go on the web, you can find things. Living Well and Gary's work, Samson's work in Australia have made survivors much more able to access some clear factual information. But we need more. And we need those myths to be challenged. We know that when a survivor discloses, they can be particularly vulnerable to other effects. So there can be trigger points throughout the life course, and we need to think about that across mainstream services. Relationship, both formation and breakup can be trigger points. The birth of a child, other stressful events. Invasive medical and dental procedures can trigger people, but also be a barrier to seeking help. These aren't necessarily male-specific, but many men have spoken about these experiences. But also, the important thing here for professionals is this is an opportunity to bring about some positive change in men's lives, to seek assistance, for them to know they're not alone, and for men to begin that journey of healing across the life course. We know some things are not helpful, and we know some things are helpful from the research. Some of those things we saw before in some of the predictions of greater mental health effects: suppression, withdrawal, denial, internalisation, anger. Things often we associate with men, that men lock away things. These aren't helpful. Accepting you've got to carry it all on your own, not helpful. We know these things can be predictive of greater difficulties. Often the idea of revenge can be very captivating for men, but it's not helpful in the long run. It's anger for a reason, and anger needs to be acknowledged. But it also needs to be put in the context of men's own stand. Many survivors have very strong stands against violence against women, against violence in general. We need to be thinking about that. The interesting thing a lot of men said to us is they're not interested in purely a cathartic or therapeutic response. They want practical outcomes. Keep on telling your story without some sense of action can be problematic. Productive coping is about producing hope, and you'll see that as a theme of the call for action. That there's a sense of feeling present with someone who's real. We deliberately don't identify particular models of working, but rather orientate to trauma-informed and survivor-informed responses. Having someone who's present, who's real, as one man said to me, I want to be speaking to someone who shows me their heart. They've got a heart there. And developing a sense of hope and solidarity with other survivors can be immensely empowering. And with that brings compassion, optimism, and ways that survivors can re-engage with important relationships. Their stories are very powerful to other survivors, and that's why that solidarity of survivors and practitioners is so critical to the work of living well. I won't go back through what we know. I think we've covered a lot of those things, but it's very important to note what we know. We also need to know proximal factors or other issues that might exacerbate effects for men, and men being on that journey of insight. So in moving forward, we need to think about how we do this knowledge transfer and application. We need to incorporate that in mainstream, not just simply specialist services. Specialist services have a place to play for men, but it's not necessarily where men arrive or seek help.